Welcome back, everyone. Today we're tackling a topic that's been at the center of food debates for years. GMOs. From your grocery store to your dinner plate. Genetically modified organisms have quietly become part of our daily lives. But how did they get here? What foods are we actually talking about? And why does the biotech industry seem so secretive about labeling them? Stick around as we break down the facts, debunk the myths, and give you the inside scoop on what's really happening with GMOs in our food supply. Welcome, Patrick.
Well, thank you, Ahmed. And it's good to be able to talk about this theme that's been such a part of Americans' lives and such a part of my life. You know, as English teacher here, I'll often encounter students who have had their degrees in biotechnology. And a question I'll always ask them is, what do you think about genetically modified organisms, and do you think that they are safe? And almost invariably, they say there's no risks, any characterization of risk is just fake news. And I wonder what kind of education students are getting today where they don't even acknowledge or they can't even articulate the risks, because with any new technology, we have to balance the promise with the peril. Now, there's one company that is associated more than any other company with genetically modified food, and the name of that company is Monsanto. Now, glyphosate.
Where is this company
it's
from?
Based in the United States. Glyphosate is their flagship product, but it wasn't always the case. For a long time, they made most of their money selling DDT. And according to my research, DDT was actually responsible for the polio epidemic. It was a contamination that caused polio. And when Rachel Carson wrote her book Silent Spring in 1963, and this book is attributed for kickstarting the environmental movement, it was this vision of a spring without any birds, and it was all about what DDT was doing to the environment. It made DDT unfashionable, and then soon it was illegal. But there was a big cover-up about what DDT was doing to our bodies, because in the 50s, they were very optimistic about science and technology, and it was a different epoch, and they would spray the DDT right on the crops, and they would eat it, and people would get paralysis. So this company didn't just come out of nowhere.
Okay, first of all, tell us what are GMOs and how did they enter the food supply?
Well, GMOs, of course, stands for genetically modified organisms. In Spanish, they call it trans food, comida transgénica. And they came in the 90s. And what it is you modify the seeds to be able to do certain things. There are seeds that make it so when flies or insects bite on the crop, the stomachs of the insects will explode. But one of the main functions of genetically modified food, which I'd like to talk about today, is to modify it genetically so that it can withstand chemicals, including glyphosate. The vernacular term is Roundup. When you see those people walking around Ecuador with those tanks on their backs spraying the weeds, that's more often than not, that's glyphosate. And the scientific name is glyphosate. The layman's term is Roundup. And at the end of the 90s, they made their Roundup Ready corn. And now glyphosate is sprayed on crops from airplanes. And it's sprayed on crops that aren't even GMOs. But it's had an effect on agriculture. And, you know, we often hear that through the Green Revolution, when industrial farming was suddenly able to supposedly through industrial farming and methods to mass fertilize crops, there was hope that we could end starvation through through this farming, but it's what's called the Green Revolution has led to a situation where we're facing monoculture rather than biodiversity. It's caused a lot of local farmers to have to move to the cities, and now the seed supply is being threatened because when farmers buy the Monsanto, for example, their Roundup Ready corn, they have to buy patents on it. And one of the ways that Monsanto tests if a farmer is paying royalties to them, and they state this in court, is they will spray along the edges of a farmer's field, and if the crops die, then they know that farmer's all okay, he's not using their product, because their product, the crops don't die when they spray it. So
interesting.
it's eco-terrorism.
Yeah.
And once that glyphosate, for example, gets into like an organic farm in the organic soil, it's over. But as we've seen, like in Mexico, where organic corn farms are downwind from farms that have the Monsanto corn, the corn travels in the wind and cross-pollinates and takes over the organic corn. And in America right now, there's an epidemic of chronic disease. And it's not in the news, and this is something I know people in Latin America and people in the Middle East don't know about, but there is an epidemic of chronic disease in the United States right now. We don't know if it's one thing or several things. It could be a lot of different things, but genetically modified food has not led to better health. The way to make more food is to build up local communities and let local communities take care of it.
What foods are GMOs?
Well, corn is a big one. Soy, sugar beets. In the United States, most of the sugar doesn't come from sugar cane. It actually comes from sugar beets, which are genetically modified, and it's in a lot. It's in a lot of food.
And what does the biotech industry claim are the risks?
Well, it's interesting because supposedly they did safety testing, and they pay their scientists and their lawyers exorbitant sums of money to be able to use clever wording and convoluted arguments. But they said that there aren't any risks because any risks are unknown risks, because we've never had this in our food supply. And so they wind up redefining the word risk. But they actually made the argument that because the genetically modified organisms and the chemicals that they spray on them affects the bacteria level, that it should be okay for humans, because humans aren't bacteria. But actually we know exactly the opposite is true, that there's more bacteria in our bodies than cells, because bacteria is smaller. And stomach function, which then feeds into brain function, is absolutely dependent on bacteria, probiotics. And a lot of people in the United States, they might think they're depressed, they might think they have a mental disorder, when really there's something that's happening in the stomach. Because if our stomach isn't functioning right, if there's something wrong with our gut, then we're going to feel it in our emotions, and we might not recognize it as a stomach problem. I've also heard that eating genetically modified organisms and having the glyphosate in our bodies actually makes our bodies into pesticide-making machines, and our bodies then mimic the effect of the pesticides.
Okay, why has the industry fought so hard against labeling?
Well, they've had referendums, and Monsanto has spies working for them. They're like an intelligence organization, and they've done studies, and they know from market analysis that if food was labeled and said it contains GMOs, and other food sat on the counter and said does not contain GMOs, that Americans would opt for the food that doesn't contain the GMOs. But as long as it's not labeled, it's out of sight, out of mind. Now,
okay.
Monsanto also has a very aggressive a team that works on pushing genetically modified organisms on the third world. They work very close with the State Department. In fact, this was one of the takeaways from the documentary film Genetic Roulette, The Gamble of Our Lives, is that the State Department actually works with Monsanto to make smaller countries dependent on GMOs. So, for example, when the United States went into Iraq, they actually wrote into the new Iraqi constitution that they had to use the Monsanto seeds. And of course, Iraq, the birthplace of civilization, Mesopotamia, for thousands of years, the farmers had a way to pass down the seeds every year to the next generation for the next harvest, and all that was gone in the split second. I don't think people realize with monoculture, where mono means one, that in 1 year the biodiversity and the seeds can go out. In India, there's this phenomenon of the farmers drinking the pesticides, farm suicides, because they are convinced that they can use this new technology and it'll do great things, and then they realize they can't compete. When a field has glyphosate sprayed on it, it can only be used then for the Roundup Ready corn. It can't be used for anything else.
Okay, so could you please tell us shortly about regulatory capture?
Well, yeah, in the United States we have these regulatory agencies, the FDA, Food and Drug Administration, the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, the AMA, the American Medical Association, and they approve the food, they approve the medicine, they approve, they regulate. And when these regulatory agencies approve something like fluoride or aspartame or glyphosate.
And I remember we've talked about aspartame before.
Yeah. Then it's approved for the entire world, because the entire world has faith in the American regulatory agencies. So, for example, Ecuador doesn't have their own regulatory agencies because they have faith that in North America, the regulatory agencies are good enough. So they don't do safety testing for artificial sweeteners or for pesticides or for medicine. Now, in the United States, there's a revolving door between the industries, the corporations like the biotech industry, and government. So those that sit on the regulatory agencies, like the Food and Drug Administration, like the American Medical Association, they're coming from the pharmaceutical industry and they're coming from the biotech industry. And so it's a revolving door. And that's why we speak of regulatory capture, because these regulatory agencies that are part of government that should be looking out, they're actually promoting the interests of the very companies that they're supposed to regulate.
Okay, where can people go to learn more about this issue?
Well, Jeffrey Smith, the Institute for Responsible Technology, his book Seeds of Deception, his movie Genetic Roulette, these are great resources.